everyone. Since our live stream did not work last weekend on March 26th, I was asked to re-record the sermon that I gave that day. And so this is it. This is a sermon entitled Come Out, and the reading is from John 11, verses 1 through 45, and the first part is summarized. After Jewish leaders tried to arrest Jesus in Jerusalem, he escaped to the Jordan, where he got word that Lazarus of Bethany had fallen ill. Though he loved Lazarus and his family, Jesus waited 2 more days before journeying to Bethany. His disciples tried to dissuade him from returning to the area around Jerusalem for fear of the leaders who had tried to stone him, but Jesus insisted. When he arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Many of the Jews had joined the sisters, Mary and Martha, to console him. When they saw Jesus, they ran to him, telling him that had Jesus been there, their brother would not have died. And yet they confessed Jesus as Messiah. When Jesus saw Mary and Martha weeping, and the Jews who came with them also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. How would you feel if you came to life inside that tomb and no one rolled away the stone? That's the question that Pastor Chris Hoke asks when he guest preaches in his area in Washington State. It's a question that spurs a conversation that hopefully inspires the congregation to sponsor an inmate. The ministry that he has started is called One Parish, One Prisoner, and started because of a visit Pastor Chris made to an inmate preparing to re-enter his community. The questions came up, of course. Where will I live? And who will rent to me? Where will I work? And who will hire me? And perhaps most importantly, how will I get to work without a car or a license? Well, Pastor Chris often asks a follow-up question of the congregations. Do you know what the #1 reason is that someone gets sucked back into the system after getting out? He says it's not drugs or violence. It's driving under suspension, driving without a license. He calls it the legal burial system, a system where you might be alive, but the tomb is still closed. So while it might be fair to say he started this ministry, he'd probably describe it as a ministry starting and bringing him along. We at Our Saviors are familiar with that kind of thing, where the Spirit starts something and we're just trying to keep up. So he pairs congregations with inmates who will be re-entering their community within the year. He interviews the parishes, he interviews the inmates, much like we do, and he determines the sincerity and the motivation to make this work. The parishioners pray, they write letters, they look for housing, they provide transportation, and even when it all falls apart, as it often does, even when that person doubts themselves, or when the job doesn't pan out, or when the person falters, when the draw to the old life is too strong, the congregation continues to support and pray and love. Because it's not just enough to roll away the stone. It's not enough to be called out of the darkness. Jesus does not stop there. He makes a final command. He says, unbind him and let him go. If we listen closely, we hear the deep discomfort in every facet of this whole story. Jesus' life has already been threatened by those in Jerusalem. He knew his time was drawing near. He had just left Jerusalem and gone to the Jordan to find some safety and to catch his breath. And then he gets word that his beloved friend Lazarus is sick. So he declares that they're going to return. They're going to go back to Bethany, which is only 2 miles from Jerusalem. And when he does that, Thomas knew what they were facing ahead of them. Having heard that Lazarus had died, Thomas says, well, let us also go, that we may die with him. He understood the threat that they were facing when they went back. And when they got there, Jesus was confronted by Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha. More discomfort. And they say, if you had only been here, he wouldn't have died. Boy, the accusation cuts like a knife. If Jesus had been present, they could have returned to business as usual. They could have gone back to their lives and gone back to their health and avoided this horrid detail of life, this death, at least for the time being. And Jesus wept. He wept for the loss of his friend. He wept for the grief of the sisters. He wept for the reality of his mortality that's facing him. He wept for the truth that would continue to be misunderstood. The truth that death is not the end. The truth that the resurrection and life is standing right there. And with the exception of a very few, goes unrecognized. He wept the tears of the God who loves so deeply a people who cannot understand that kind of love. And he ordered the stone to be removed. Because what good is life if it is kept hidden? And he ordered Lazarus to come out, because sometimes life needs a little nudge into the light. And he ordered the people to unbind him and let him go, to let him be seen, to let him be recognized, to let him live, even though this very act is going to put a target on both Jesus and Lazarus' backs for the rest of their lives. So how would you feel? How would you feel if you came to life inside that tomb and no one rolled away the stone? Probably much like the young person who looks at themselves in the mirror and sees someone they don't recognize. Someone who isn't who they know themselves to be. They see only a tomb, a false self that has been defined by those who think they know better. Just as death is a normal, expected part of life, our culture has the same expectations about gender. You're either alive or you're dead. You're either a girl or a boy. But today's story turns our expectations of what can and should be upside down. Jesus commands that the stone be rolled away, that death can sometimes be a new beginning. That what we think we know of this world and this life is only a minuscule part of what is truth. How would you feel if the stone were not rolled away for you? You'd feel lost. confused and scared. But it isn't enough to simply roll away the stone. It isn't enough to then, after the stone has been removed, turn away in fear of what is going to come out. Fear of the sights and the smells. It isn't enough to simply unlock the prison bars and say, now off you go, be free and prosper. It isn't enough to leave the world as it is, hateful and hurtful to those who emerge different than what we have deemed appropriate. Because after death, how can we be anything other than different? And it isn't enough for Jesus to simply say, come out. For life to re-emerge into the light, re-entering the world without assurance that they won't be forced back into the dark and into death. Because coming out is dangerous. Coming out is dangerous. It puts a target on your back. Because so many don't understand the new life being offered. So many don't agree that new life should even be an option. So many are angry because they don't see themselves being offered new life. And it isn't new life until someone hears Jesus' command and follows through. Unbind him and let him go. Essentially, he's saying, release Lazarus from his death clothes and release him from your fear. Release him from your expectations of what life and death should be and let him live this new life. Release them from the rotten things that have kept them locked away. Things like labels and pronouns and narrowly defined roles. Release her from your fear of what she might do with this life. Release them from their history, from their before lives, from their past mistakes, from our own false misunderstandings. And who doesn't want this for yourself? To be brought from death to life, to have a new chance, to be who you truly are without all the past influences and all the past mistakes. Who doesn't want to be unbound and set free to truly live? And yes, this is fraught with discomfort. And it is fraught with fear and trepidation, but it is also filled with courage and with determination. One doesn't leave the tomb without wondering how far they'll get before someone shuts them down. One doesn't roll away the stone without wondering what is going to emerge. One doesn't release the body without pondering how the spirit is going to move through it and disrupt the carefully cultivated lives of the contained. And yet Jesus commands, roll away the stone. Come out, unbind them and let them go. Let them live their true selves. Let them thrive. Even though that very act will be Jesus' final undoing. It will solidify his opponent's desire to stop him at whatever cost necessary. Because you see, sometimes God's grace and love are too much for us to bear. It's why we try to keep strict control over it. And yet God cannot be controlled. And God refuses to be protected. And God willingly follows the trajectory set by the gracious acts of love lavished upon the hungry and the hurt and the broken and the marginalized and even the dead. Soon we're going to hear that God enters Jerusalem, knowing full well the only exit will be through death and resurrection. And yet God will never stop calling us out of our tombs and into new life.